Hello, my name is Jennie Tsekwa, and as part of this conference, I'm going to be talking to you on the topic of what kids need in conversations about race and racism. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a member of God First Church in Bromfontein in Johannesburg, along with my husband and Paul and our three sons, Toriso and Lesedi, who are our twins, they're 9 years old, and Khotso, who is 3. So I was born in the United States, but grew up in Malaysia and the Philippines, and then moved to South Africa 14 years ago to study at the University of Cape Town, where I met Mpho. We got married, moved back to Johannesburg in 2013, which is where he's originally from. We now work for a ministry called Wycliffe Bible Translation, which is based in Edenvale here in Johannesburg. And Mpho and I are also the founding members of an organization called the Kopanya Institute, along with 2 friends and close colleagues, Sarah Pinckney Jones and Jean Mirren. When I was approached to give this talk, I was so excited. This is a topic that is very close to our hearts, and the closer it got to having to do this recording, though, the more I realized, my goodness, this is going to be a lot more challenging than I thought. We've had family members who have just tested positive for COVID. My husband is actually in self-isolation as I'm doing this recording. Our youngest is home with us 24/7, and the twins have been going through their own anxiety around returning to school 3 weeks ago. So these are not easy times, and that's even for a family like ours that has a roof over our head, place to sleep, food on the table. And so I can imagine that for some of you, as you saw the title for this talk, maybe you had second thoughts around whether you have capacity or if it's the right time for it. To talk to kids about race and racism. But the more I've sat with it, the more I'm convinced that it's for such a time as this. A time of heightened emotions, heightened fear and anxiety, and heightened uncertainty. We need to talk about these things, and I'm very grateful for the conference organizers for including it. Research shows that when we're under pressure, feeling overwhelmed, stressed, backed into a corner, or frustrated by lack of control over one's circumstances or what's going on in the world around you, that this is exactly when our unconscious biases and prejudices are likely to kick in. And we're much more likely to do or say something out of our racial conditioning, and which we might likely regret or be defensive about. Now add to that picture the fact that you have little ones either in your home, in your Sunday school class, or in your care that are watching you, watching your every move and looking up to you as their heroes and role models. It is for such a time as this that we need to be able to talk to kids about race and racism, to engage with their questions, to be present also to their silences, and the fact that they might be looking for a safe space in which to speak up, to ask questions, and to make sure that they're not feeling judged. There are 2 important things that I also want to say as part of this introduction before getting into the talk itself. Firstly, that this talk is way too short to do justice to such a complex and challenging topic as race and racism. To give a bit more context, the content that I'm going to be sharing with you comes from Kopanya's 8-week course titled Talking to Kids About Race and Racism. And we found that even those 8 weeks when we run the course usually feel too short. So if I get to the end of this talk and you feel a sense of incompletion, that's very normal and natural, and probably a good thing in the sense that it will encourage you to keep exploring, keep thinking on this topic, and keep looking for resources and ways to equip yourself. You're more than welcome to contact me. I'd be very happy to share more resources on this topic. And then secondly, whenever we have this conversation, and I'm very aware of this even for myself as I present to you today, that we need to reflect and be very open about our own stories, our own upbringing, and the positionalities that affect the way we engage with this conversation. So from my side, and to share a little bit more about my story, doing work on race and racism has been a long journey and a process for me, because I was raised in a household with very loving, God-fearing parents, but where there was little to no conversations on the topic of race that I can recall. And this is a big silence considering our history in the United States. I only came into an awareness of racism in my late teens and felt a huge sense of betrayal and guilt for my ignorance and complicity, but also a sense of responsibility And so I've had to work through the question of who I am to talk about this topic, given this skin that I'm in, and this accent, and this background. But thankfully, through walking this journey with others, the question for me has shifted to, who am I not to talk about this topic? If there was a deafening silence in my church and community growing up, then I need to be part of breaking the silence. And so my hope for this talk is that it will spark some ideas on where to start and areas that need attention in our churches, in our homes, our schools, and our social circles. Because even though the theme is what kids need, I'm more and more convinced through conversations that I've had with many parents, many educators, that this is what adults need as well. So if you have a piece of paper handy, and if not, that's also fine, you can do this exercise in your heads. I would like you to write down the most challenging question that you've ever been asked by a child or a young person about race and racism. Or it could be a question that you asked, either out loud to an adult, or that you might have asked internally in your head when you were a child about race. I'll repeat those questions again. So the first one is, what is the most challenging question you've ever been asked by a child or a young person about race or racism? Or when you were a child, what is a question that you had that you may have asked to an adult or that you might just have thought about and not shared with anyone? These are questions that you can come back to if nothing comes to mind immediately. But the next question that I'd like to ask, if you do have a question in mind, is in the first case, when it was a question asked by a child or young person to you, did you feel you were able to provide a satisfactory answer? Why or why not? And in the second case, thinking back to a question you might have asked when you were a child, did you feel that your question was answered satisfactorily? Was it even safe for you to ask the question? And how did these questions make you feel? Anxious, inspired, despairing? For me, I have experienced the full gambit of emotions when engaging with children around this topic, the topic of race and racism, from my own children, as well as the children in their school, in their Sunday school, and in other contexts. Sometimes I feel hope, and I hold on to those moments very dearly. But often I've felt despair that they've been exposed to and internalized the racism in our society, in our world, so quickly. My 9-year-old twins have asked me questions like, Mommy, why are you pink and Papa is brown? Or Mommy, if you had married a pink person, what color would I be? And Mommy, why are pink people treated better than brown people? We have overheard them discussing why all their teachers at school are the same color and what this means. So it's clear, kids notice. They are definitely not colorblind as many people would like to convince themselves or hope for. And this is very evident in many cases recently of young people speaking up about their experiences of discrimination and racism at schools in South Africa, as well as many young people participating in the Black Lives Matter movement that is happening right now in the United States. And these are just two examples. And the older they get, the more challenging the questions. A few years ago, there was a school that I was working with around some issues of diversity. And around that time, the school did not appropriately recognize the death of a famous struggle hero in South African history. When several of the students of color objected, they were countered with other narratives that emerged about her involvement with violent acts and how should the school be expected to honor the passing of a so-called murderer. Fed up with this rhetoric, one student of color went to a teacher that he felt safe with and asked the following question. We are being challenged about why we should honor someone who committed violence, but can't I ask the same question about our headmaster? We know he was in the army during apartheid, so surely he killed people. How must we respect him? As I've thought about these questions and others, and how to navigate some deeply troubling racist incidences that my young boys have already had to face, I've come to the realization that many parents and educators are ill-equipped to help children and teenagers navigate racial identities and the realities of continued systemic and interpersonal racisms. Developmental psychology research is showing that by the time they start kindergarten, and possibly even younger, children are already beginning to show many of the same implicit racial attitudes that adults have. Children learn very quickly to associate some groups with higher status or more positive value than others, which is the bedrock that race and racism were built on. Some research also suggests that this acquisition of racial attitudes varies across groups. In research conducted in the United States, for example, it was found that by age 5, Black and Hispanic children showed no preference toward their own group compared to white children, and on the other hand, the white children showed a strong racial bias in favor of whiteness. This should be very concerning. So how do we have conversations with our kids? What do they need from us in conversations about race and racism? I'd like to share a model with you that we've developed through years of conversations, research, and lived experience. It is called What Kids Need in Conversations About Race and Racism. And as you can see in the image on the screen, it includes 8 elements that kids need. And as I've mentioned earlier, this applies to adults too. So these 8 elements are safe space and validation, critical thinking and finding their voice, helpful concepts and correct information, deep listening and being present, conscious role modeling, inner grounding, self-care and emotional literacy, and curiosity and an adventurous spirit. Today I'm only going to have time to talk to you about 4 of these, but as I mentioned earlier, I'd be more than happy to provide further resources if this is something helpful and of interest to you. So let's look at the first element in the model, safe space and validation. This is foundational for conversations about race and racism with children and with adults as well. We can create safe spaces in so many different ways, but they all require intentionality and awareness. I'll give some examples. So allowing children to ask questions and make observations about race and racism without us shaming them or silencing them. To do this, we need to have worked through some of our own baggage and our need to preserve a particular image, especially if these questions or comments are made in public. Giving children space to feel intense emotions, in other words, being able to hold these emotions with empathy, rather than trying to fix them or put a lid on them, even when we are triggered ourselves. Not being dismissive if they say that they've experienced or observed racial incidences or racism at school or in other contexts. There are 2 extremes that we should be conscious of as adults. The tendency of adults to dismiss or ignore, or the tendency to overreact and go into a situation with guns blazing rather than taking the time to investigate and fully understand. And both extremes can make a situation feel very unsafe for a child. Letting the child know that we might not have all the answers, but that we will find the answer with them. Also being vulnerable and open about how tough this topic is, and being willing to show emotion to a child in an appropriate way. Sharing with a child a time in your own life when you've had a similar experience or emotion and how you handled it. In this way, they won't feel that they are alone or abnormal because of their feelings. And if you haven't had a similar experience, you can also say that. For example, saying, I've never experienced what you're going through, but I would really like to understand it and support you in it. Let me share an example of creating a safe space. During one of our courses, a teacher shared about his discomfort on one particular day when a child spoke up in class and said that his grandmother, who is white, doesn't like Black people and won't allow his Black friends to come to her house. And the teacher could immediately hear the shame that was already present in this child's voice. The teacher admitted that before learning about creating safety and safe spaces, he would most likely have shut down the conversation, maybe afraid of where it would lead or what the other kids would think, or that it would be a bad reflection on him as a teacher. But instead, he took a deep breath, calmed his inner nerves, and said to the child, that must be really hard. How does it make you feel? And he said the atmosphere in the classroom shifted immediately. Quite emotionally, the child said that it made him really upset. and suddenly found the whole class offering their support to help him process how to deal with this racism in his own family. It was a learning moment for the whole class, rather than a moment where the child could have carried that shame with him into adulthood for saying the wrong thing or admitting something about his family. So validation is closely linked to creating safe spaces, and it's a really powerful tool for having empowering conversations. It's defined in the dictionary as recognition or affirmation that a person or their feelings or opinions are valid or worthwhile. Validation doesn't mean that we have to agree or understand the emotions or thoughts that a child is expressing, but it does mean we need to create space for them and treat them with respect and value. Parents and caregivers can often feel a strong drive to solve problems that our children are facing. And that's not a bad thing. And it's sometimes very much needed. However, validation pauses before trying to fix the problem. It's sitting with the child in the emotion rather than trying to change the emotion. Remember, emotions are always valid. In contrast, behaviors or the expression of these behaviors may not always be correct. Therefore, validation doesn't mean a child has permission to act however they want to, but it can really help them see all their options and make better choices once they've named and released what that emotion is. So, I hope you're picking up from these elements that kids need more from us than just intellectual answers in order to navigate the complexities and trauma of race and racism. And as adults, we have to really practice this because safe space and validation doesn't always come easy or naturally. The second element that I want to speak to you about is critical thinking and finding their voice. It is absolutely essential that we equip the children in our lives with critical thinking skills for engaging with race and racism in all its manifestations. This means that we must daily practice and stretch our own critical thinking skills on this topic. We hear the phrase a lot, especially if we work in the field of education, but what exactly is critical thinking? Most definitions suggest that it's a way of objectively analyzing and evaluating an issue in order to form a judgment. But we are cautious about, and we should be cautious about the notion of objectivity, which can remove the thinker from having to identify their own subjectivity, their own biases, and like I shared earlier, the ways in which our own stories have led us to view the world in a particular way. Instead, a better definition might be that critical thinking is a way of thinking in which you don't simply accept all the arguments and conclusions that you are presented with, but rather an attitude involving questioning such arguments and conclusions. Unpacking the racial stereotypes or messaging that is so often embedded in popular television shows and movies is one way to practice critical thinking with kids. Without critical awareness, children and adults simply absorb what is portrayed in the media as if it's true. So my husband shared with me how he had loved watching the Shaka Zulu TV show growing up, but was horrified when he later watched it as an adult and saw, as if seeing for the first time, all the racial stereotypes that he had been exposed to and just absorbed as a kid. So we need to help children to unpack these stereotypes, and our gut instinct when our child might bring a stereotype home might be to immediately correct it. The danger is, though, that this will create dependency on us for the answers. Instead, we can ask questions that encourage critical thinking. Where did they hear it? Do they think it's true? Are there alternative possibilities? And how would they feel if they were part of the group that was being labeled in that way? Importantly, a less spoken about characteristic of critical thinking, and vitally important when we're talking about race and racism, is humility. This means being willing to admit when we don't have all the answers, or we're not sure, or actually when we might have been wrong. It's very hard for adults to do, but we need to be aware of how modeling or not modeling humility affects the children in our lives. And I'm so aware that this is a balancing act and a skill that is developed over time. Alongside the humility to accept when one is not sure, or when maybe one held wrong views in the past, to think critically through all the possible answers to a particular question or problem is important. But we also don't want our children to get lost in everyone else's opinions. We want them to find their voice, rooted and grounded in their own experience, which might be completely new or different to what we experienced as their parents or caregivers. By voice, I mean the ability to recognize their own beliefs, to practice articulating them in a variety of forms, and then find the confidence to express them. And again, similar to the other what kids need elements, we have to model this for our kids. If we can't speak our truth as adults or have struggled to find our own voice, it's going to be really hard to help our children know how to speak truth into a situation. We also need to help children know how to choose their battles, especially around race and racism, and how to discern when it's best to speak up and when it might be okay to remain silent. Discernment around how to use different platforms, especially related to social media, is also really critical. There are so many creative starting points for helping a child or a young person find their voice, such as talking or writing about the meaning of their name, using things like performance, artistic expression, and creative play. But at a deeper level, the best way that adults can encourage children's voices is to assume that a child's perspective or opinion about something is just as important as yours, to assume that you can also learn from a child just as they can learn from you, and to proactively enter into their world. This type of engagement and honoring of children's perspective builds both trust and confidence around tough topics, and a child is much more likely to bring their tough questions to you. So let me give you an example of a tough question that kids ask. And this question came to us from a parent. It's a real question that they were asked and that they were deeply troubled by. The child had asked them, "Why is God white? Does God not like black people?" And questions like this, I know the first time I heard it, it can be a big trigger for an adult, especially as you try to raise your child in the faith, and yet maybe are also very aware of the complicated relationship between religion and race. So again, it's very important to be conscious of one's own triggers and to manage them so that you can create an open and safe space for a child to ask tough questions like this. Firstly, it's important to find out more from the child before trying to answer. So for example, you could ask, "What do you think? Do you think God is white? What is causing you to think that he doesn't like black people?" Questions like these can provide rich insights into the child's interior world and what they are processing, which is of greater value than just giving them a quick answer like, "Of course he's not white. God doesn't have a race." This might be true, but it doesn't get to the bottom of what they are grappling with. So it can be really helpful to explore with them, what does the Bible say about it? Does it talk about God's appearance or skin color? Or is this just an idea that people came up with? You can ask the child what they believe about God more generally. For example, do you think God loves all the people he created? If not, why not? And if this turns into a theological discussion about why a loving God can allow some people to be treated better in the world than others, and if you feel ill-equipped, we invite you to reach out to a mentor from within your church to help unpack these questions in a child-friendly way. They're not easy. And depending on the age of the child and what they share in terms of what prompted the question, you may also want to talk about the religious imagery that so often portrays Jesus and other biblical figures as white. Encourage them to think critically about this, and if necessary, go into the historical explanation of how whiteness has been privileged and has extended even into sacred and religious spaces. People want God to look like them so they can have their own beliefs about themselves and others affirmed. The children in our lives need to be empowered with critical thinking skills and the ability to find their voice in the midst of all the opinions and voices that they will encounter. So this ability to ask questions and to speak up can be nurtured from a very young age. And we as adults can come to see these tough questions as gifts rather than as something that is stressful. Children have a way of naming things, of surfacing things that often as adults we've been conditioned into avoiding or treating as taboo. The third element is helpful concepts and correct information. And this works really well alongside the previous one I spoke about around critical thinking. So as a child grows, an important building block for equipping them to navigate the pain or the privileges that they've experienced related to race and racism is to provide them with helpful concepts and correct information. This is not as easy as it sounds because as adults, we can easily confuse fact and opinion, and we can also struggle with clarity around complex concepts and ideas. So the most important thing here is not to aim for perfection or having all the answers, and thus never measuring up, but rather to actively seek out tools and information that can be passed on to the children in our lives, and to critically examine our sources of information for ourselves. So helpful concepts include the words ascribed to particular experiences or ideas, and the definitions or meanings of those words. They're like road markings or the key on a map. While there might be some ambiguity and room for differences of opinion, these markings or definitions enable us to have a common understanding of what we're actually talking about. For example, red means stop, we all know that. Double lines means don't cross. And so having names for experiences like racism, exclusion, bullying, discrimination, and knowing the differences and similarities between these words and experiences can create a common language to help children identify what is affecting them and what is going on in the world around them. Helpful concepts that are well defined allow a child to assess situations better and have more meaningful conversations and make better decisions. Side by side with helpful concepts, children need correct information. Going back to the analogy of the map, correct information is like a map with the right street names, or updated if street names change, the right intersections and everything laid out to scale. A map with inaccurate street names or distorted scale will inevitably lead to confusion and frustration. So children need parents, teachers, and caregivers who are properly informed of historical and current events, who know who the key role players and leaders are, and who are aware of the different sides of a debate. We as adults need to regularly be asking them what they are learning in school about race and racism and related histories. So let me give you an example of how to break down concepts in language that kids can understand. So take this question, for example. Teacher, what is race? So with any tough question about race or racism, like I've already mentioned, we strongly recommend starting by affirming the child for asking the question, and then continuing from a point of inquiry and curiosity, rather than anxiety or fear of not giving the child the right answer. For this question, it could mean starting with the following response. That's a really important question, and I'd love to talk to you about it. What do you think race is? And if they say, I don't know, which is very possible, don't push them for an answer or make them feel bad for not knowing, but gently probe with a few more questions. Have your teachers or classmates talked about it at school? Where did you hear about it? Any guess as to what it might be? And then after exploring their thoughts, you can proceed to break it down for them in simple terms if it feels like the right time. There's also really helpful visual illustrations and a lot of useful kids' books out there that can help them understand the difference between the spectrum of skin colors that makes up humanity and the categories of race that have been created historically. So in terms of skin color, you can explain that all of us are born with varying skin colors from very light to very dark, and there are often various shades of skin even in the same family. None are better than others, and we are all unique. Whereas race, and this is really critical for kids to understand, race is not inherent in our DNA or in our biology. It's a belief system that was invented by human beings some centuries ago that says that it is possible to group people into categories or groups based on their skin color, and then to say that some categories are better than others. Labels or boxes were invented for each category, with the associated belief that people in each box are all the same. So these are the simple terms. Kids understand boxes, they understand categories. And instead of appreciating the spectrum of variation, when you look at skin color, you can explain to a child that when it comes to race, people are judged according to the box that others put them in. So that's one example, and in our workbooks, we explore a whole host of these questions, getting into what is racism, how does it manifest, and the many ways that children ask these questions. So I'm going to cover now the fourth element, deep listening and being present. This is directly linked back to safe space and validation, and is often so important for having these conversations and answering the tough questions, like the examples that I've given. So according to one definition, deep listening is a process of listening to learn. It requires the temporary suspension of judgment, a willingness to receive new information, whether pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Sometimes it's hard to listen deeply to children because we're distracted, impatient, or have forgotten that we actually have a lot to learn from them. For these and other reasons, we need to actively practice deep listening on a regular basis. When engaging with children, some of the things that can help us engage and listen more deeply are being fully present and just slowing down, not rushing them if they're talking slowly or taking their time to express a thought or an idea. Putting away our tablets, our devices, our phones, tuning into their body language, asking more specific questions than just, how was your day? Or what was that like? Remembering that the world can be an overwhelming place and that they are under a lot of pressure at school and in other contexts. Being aware of not projecting your own feelings or thoughts onto a child, and not taking sides if you're mediating a conflict where emotions and opinions are running high. Also not using their vulnerability as an opportunity to push your own agenda or opinions, and not pushing a child to keep talking if he or she seems satisfied or wants to stop what they're sharing. And most of all, meeting them where they're at, tuning into their level of understanding. So as highlighted by these examples, being present is critical for listening deeply, and it takes a great amount of intentionality. And to do so, we have to be first present to ourselves and as adults and what is going on in our brains, our hearts, and our guts whenever a situation around race and racism arises. However, as I've mentioned, we're often in such a hurry that tough conversations or questions can feel like an intrusion or an inconvenience, and we will often be quick to brush them to the side. But let me share another example. I remember one day I was finally sitting down to dinner after a very long, hard day, and one of my sons was sitting next to me, and he said quite tentatively, "Mommy, is it okay if I ask you a question?" And I kind of half distractedly said, "Of course it's fine." And he said, "Mommy, why are some people treated better than others?" And it was one of those moments where you can tell that the child wants to say something more, but they're hesitating, perhaps out of an anxiety or not sure of what to say or if it's okay for them to ask. And I could have given one of those quick parent answers like, well, that's just the way life is. People aren't always nice to each other. But instead, remembering how important it is to slow down, to be present, and to listen deeply, I tried to put my busy day to the side and really lean towards him and ask, "No, tell me more." And I could visibly notice him relaxing. And then after a pause, he said, "Mommy, why are pink people treated better than brown people?" Remember that example I gave at the beginning. So he had wanted to ask me a question about discrimination all along. And it turned out these are things that he was observing at school and feeling really troubled about. But he was testing the waters with his first question to see if I was really available. Was it safe for him to ask? And was I willing to engage with him? And I have to be honest, there are many times when I haven't been available as a parent. But through practice, we can become more and more aware of how important it is to our children to be present and to listen deeply to them, especially in the times we're living in, and especially around tough topics. And part of being present is also being very aware of how we are showing up, both verbally and non-verbally. What are we role modeling to them? What tone do we use to the people around us? What conversations are happening in the home between us and our spouse or other family members, amongst our extended families and our relatives? What are we role modeling in our Sunday school classes and from the pulpit? These are the type of questions that we need to ask to be ready to have conversations with kids about race and racism. So in closing, I'd like to share a final story with you. Our boys had asked us to record the recent shuttle launch, But instead, when I went to play it back for them, I found that the recording was actually showing some of the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening in the United States. And the boys were very interested and asked me so many questions about what was going on. It quite unexpectedly resulted in a very important conversation about the movement and the need to stand up for the marginalized and the oppressed. And that night, one of the twins prayed, "Dear God, please stop racism. Make sure it never comes back, even after I pass away someday. Please let it never come back." I was very touched by my son's long view forward, that he wants the change to last long after even he is gone, and he's only 9 years old. And I want to be part of that change that my son is praying for. Often in our workshops or courses, people have said, "But where do I start? I can't fix the whole world. What do? I feel overwhelmed." Please don't let that feeling of overwhelm paralyze you. There are so many places that we can start. And in fact, one of the first places to start, if you are asking those questions or feeling overwhelmed, is to write a whole list of reasons why you feel overwhelmed, why you don't know what to do, and where to start. And if you are someone who has been trying to raise your voice about these issues, and you're either feeling labeled as a troublemaker or being told that you're being divisive, please don't give up. You're not alone. More and more of us need to join this conversation. Bringing God's kingdom on earth requires sustained action and the pursuit of justice in our generation and as an inheritance that we pass on to our children. As it is written in Isaiah 58, verse 6, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke." All of us have a role to play. Thank you.